Welcome to Espresso Talks, your source for interviews with a wide range of unique people from diverse backgrounds around the world. I'm your host, Anthony T. Eaton.
Valery and Ellen, so good to see you again. I appreciate you making some more time for us to sit down and have another espresso talk.
Of course.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yes.
Oh, you're very welcome. So the last time that we sat down, we were talking about your first book, Nurses on the Inside, Stories of the HIV and AIDS Epidemic in New York. It was a great conversation, and we got a lot of great feedback from that. So I'm excited here to talk about your new book, Beyond the Mask. We talked about the parallels between what was going on with the coronavirus pandemic and the HIV pandemic. So I think it's a great kind of segue for this new book. And I really love the way you set the story up in the beginning. Talk a little bit about how you two kind of crafted that and decided what the format and direction was going to be, because I know it's obviously it's based in what has really gone on, but it's also a fictional work.
Probably 50% is fiction. All of it is based on real stories. And out of the 6 main characters, 3 are actually real people. And those backstories are true. The other 3 main characters are compilations of people that we have worked with over the years. And then we put the stories of different nurses that we interviewed throughout the country. I mean, mostly I got these people on Facebook because there was a huge Facebook page about COVID healthcare providers, and nurses especially were venting like these lengthy soliloquies about what was going on in their hospital.
That opening scene was something that I wanted to do to try to give people an idea about how the virus might spread amongst regular people, and also to set up a little anxiety, because I'm sort of hoping that that's what it did.
It did, absolutely. When I read that, I was in the moment, because I don't think we think about those things of how disease is spread and how germs work and what we are doing as individuals in terms of spreading disease. And
I argue with myself all the time about germs. I'm sort of I think about germs all the time, and then I say, well, exposure to germs can lead to a robust immune system. And then we get something like this where, hand washing becomes critical, and not sharing the air becomes critical, and, droplet nuclei become super critical. And I waffle back and forth between those 2 ideas. But for the book, I wanted to give people the idea that, here are regular people and it could happen to anybody.
Unbeknownst to us that we're already infected with something and we're spreading it to other people through just our regular social behaviors. But there's also a lot of differences with what we've seen in this pandemic, especially, Ellen, to what you were talking about in terms of today we have all of this social media and nurses venting. I think the public had much more access to what our healthcare providers were going through.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, they did. I mean, all you had to do was turn on the nightly news. In New York, when there was a period of time when people were clapping out their windows for heroes, that came a little later. I think what we tried to portray in the beginning chapters of the book were the calm before the storm. I guess we, in some effect, had the calm before the storm with the HIV epidemic. But here, I think it was a little bit more paralyzing as healthcare workers began to notice things, like odd things. PPE being all of a sudden locked up, which it was, and then being rationed and so on. But if you watch the news, all you saw during 2020 was like the numbers almost, how many millions, thousands, and tens of thousands of people died, and then we're in the millions, and how many people infected. It was almost like watching the election, when they saw how many electoral votes went to each candidate and so on.
In some ways, but I also feel like it was numbing for many people. I think many people started to look at it like they look at the election and started writing it off. And you can't comprehend that amount of death unless you actually see it in person, which healthcare workers were doing. But the rest of the world was not.
I would agree with that. And I think the difference between the two pandemics is HIV, the AIDS epidemic, really kind of came on slow. There was a runway to massive numbers, as opposed to this, it came on very, very quickly. It was just a matter of a couple or even a few months before we were seeing these numbers that we'd never seen since maybe the Great Flu epidemic. There
were a couple of other really important differences between these two pandemics. And the first is that the coronavirus has the potential to infect anybody and everybody. And it is basically spread by droplet nuclei. So it's, you can say you can get it from the air, if you will. It's not what we call airborne, but it is spread in the air. So that's one big difference. The other is that it was not confined to a specific group, which in many ways, HIV was confined to a cluster of groups of people who were considered disposable by the rest of society. And that's a really important distinction, I think, between COVID and HIV, is that nobody's going to say that the people who got COVID were disposable, whereas many people back in the day were thinking that gay men and women who were doing sex work were completely disposable, and PSPS are still considered disposable. So either they were get out of my emergency room types or they were citizens. And it was just kind of a stark and revolting way to divide people. I mean, either you believe people are worth something or you don't. And apparently lots of people think that some people are disposable. And so this whole thing about humans being worthwhile only applies to some people. And that's a real stark thing. That's a real stark difference.
Valery and I tried not to get very political in this book, but we did start to see that there were a lot of minority people that were considered disposable, that did not have access to care, access to education, access to testing.
But also, this is a long-term problem. This is not something that happened because of COVID. COVID invaded these communities because of this lack of education, this ignoring issues of educating children so that they know anything about science at all, so that they know anything about hygiene or how to.
We have known for a long time that there is a lack of access to even basic preventative health care for people who are minorities or poor. I think this really did shine a big spotlight on the haves and have-nots.
It did.
The people who had a public platform or who were recognizable, who came down with coronavirus, they had the means to get the best care possible. Where the Hispanic woman who works as a maid in the hotel, she just didn't have that.
Because she makes too much money for Medicaid, so she doesn't have any health insurance at all because they only let her work 35 hours a week, which isn't a full work week. So it's just every time you look at this, they're cutting people off at the pockets, and it is a huge problem. It's a huge problem.
I think it highlighted a difference in our response. We talked about this a little bit before. It was immediately apparent that from a medical standpoint, and this was due obviously to that whole point that you raised, Ellen and Valery, about people being disposable, all of the resources that were thrown at this. Even though initially it was kind of downplayed in our country, once it was evident that this is a big thing and we need to do something, resources were available.
Big resources. Huge resources, all
We had,
sponsored by your tax dollars at work.
yes. How has the book been received since it came out?
People that we know that have read it have actually enjoyed it, and there were some really great comments. I don't know if you read the Amazon reviews on the book. There was some really great comments about utilizing the fictional narratives to get a point across. We thought for a while there that we might get, kind of crucified for having a book that's fiction. When I was querying for agents, before I decided to basically self-publish, it's published by Fulton Books, but it's actually self-published by us. When I was querying for agents, people were very interested in the manuscript, but only if we decided to make this book nonfiction. Yeah, I had a conversation with an agent that went on for days via email. Actually, two different agents who were really interested, but saying, why can't this be nonfiction? And I said, because often the people that we spoke with who told us the stories and who told us the struggles in the nursing community, they did not want to be identified by name or state or hospital they work. We saw early on nurses getting fired for speaking up about lack of PPE, wanting to use hospital scrubs instead of their own. So there was just no way. Nobody in 2020 was going to go on record at all to be outspoken about what was going on.
I really like that intertwining of the fiction and nonfiction. I think we did an excellent job in blending the two. So, I really want to ask about, from the fiction point of it, did you run into any challenges of building that backstory, or did it come very easy? How did the two of you kind of work on that together?
You know what? I think it honestly came very easy. I mean, I credit Val with most of the backstory. I tend to write dialogue when I write as if I'm actually speaking it. So like some of those, the nurses like in the ICU, Sandy, Maureen, Fran, like I wrote dialogue as if I was actually speaking it. And then Valerie would handle a lot of the, what we call embroidery. I would always email her and say, this needs a little embroidery. Valerie's very descriptive about the environment, the rooms, the places people lived, and my focus was more on getting each chapter to end with a chilling revelation,
Yeah, she liked the cliffhanger part.
The cliffhanger, yes. I knew this needed to end, each chapter needed to end with a cliffhanger. Val would just sort of take it from there.
I have the great privilege of having read your first book and now this one. Obviously, you're very skilled in your, other careers, but as writers, I hope you write more books.
There was never supposed to be another book after Nurses. And then it just occurred to me that nobody's going to remember the very beginnings of this pandemic. Nobody's going to remember. I remember saying to Val, we have to memorialize this. As I was hearing a lot from my daughter, who was a PA in the emergency room. Some of those stories are hers. And hearing everything. And then I said, oh my God, I have to reach out to some of my colleagues who are still in the ICU where I used to work. And I did. And they talked to me and they told me these things that were happening. And they would send me pictures of them where they went to a fishing store and were wearing those overalls that you wear to go into the water to fish. And, all this gear that they had to make and put together. Every single thing we were taught as nurses about one mask per patient per time. You go in the room, you wear a mask, you wear gloves, you come out, discard everything, wash your hands, hand hygiene. Next time you go in, new mask, new gloves, new gown. Everything we learned about infection control was out the window.
Right, because you think that only the inside of the mask is dirty. I'm sorry, the outside of the mask is really dirty because you've been filtering stuff through that mask. So the outside of the mask is dirty.
Do you think we learned anything about this whole being prepared? Because I don't think we realized in the beginning that we were going to have all of these shortages. So many things have been affected right?
Americans, by and large, thought this couldn't happen to them. They thought this was a third world problem. They said Ebola, oh, it only happens in Africa. What's Africa? It's just, it doesn't count. Or the original SARS, that happened in China. That doesn't count. Those people aren't Americans. But this really brought people up sharply and showed where our deficiencies are, that we were never ready for this. I really do hope that there's money being given to the public health services to sort of ramp that up for the next time, because I'm sorry to report, I think there will be a next time, and it will be in our lifetime. So, you know, that's the way things are going.
What is your hope for readers to take away from the book overall?
There's several things. Number one is to recognize and memorialize who we lost. You know, we did lose nurses. The story about Mo was actually a nurse that I did know. I think the early statistics of healthcare workers that got infected and died, I think we need to memorialize. I think we need to memorialize that hospitals were not prepared. The country was not prepared for this. You know, I know that there was no pandemic team, emergency team that was assembled quickly to combat or to quell this virus in any way. And we just watched the numbers go up. And we watched the healthcare workers be totally startled by how quickly things changed, how quickly their place of employment switched over. You know, an orthopedic unit became a COVID unit. A recovery room of, you know, I didn't mention that one. We chose to do emergency room critical care in an orthopedic unit, but that really happened. I mean, recovery rooms stopped, surgery stopped, and there became tents. You know, one tent and two tents, and then people were in conference rooms. They made the auditoriums in facilities. The belongings that weren't picked up, the refrigerated trucks that had to be brought in. Now, for some, it may be a distant memory. I don't believe for a minute we should forget this.
I hope it inspires that somebody who reads it also maybe to become a nurse. I would like it if people would realize that it's an honorable and interesting profession.
It is, and I do think that we as a society probably now have a greater appreciation, I know I do, for those who are on the front lines of healthcare. I so appreciate again our having the opportunity to sit down and talk about your book. And again, I do hope there are more books, because I think you are very talented in telling the story and your background in healthcare. And there's lots of stories I think that can be told about different aspects of the healthcare industry, and you would certainly be the best to do that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.